Okay, so we had two quite distinct strands now that were developing in the thing. On the one hand, the paranormal side of it seemed to me to be convincing. Scott seemed to know all kinds of things that he couldn't possibly have known simply because they were inside our heads and had not been published, and they were, whether more than one person was involved, they were confidential. And yet Brian Scott seemed to know about these things even if he himself didn't understand them, as he kept saying. And it wasn't just our unpublished work, but other people's unpublished work. We began finding things in the messages which we hadn't understood, which made sense when somebody else published a piece of work which had been in the pipeline at the time. And all of this seemed to me to confirm that there was a paranormal element to what was happening. The question the really intriguing question was whether there was anything extraterrestrial behind it. Now, there were a number of people with different views on this. Alan Evans very strongly rejected that, because he rejected the whole thing. He was just convinced that this had been set up by somebody to whom I had broken his confidence. Another colleague of ours in Australia called Danny Varney, who's a member of the Australian Skeptics, utterly rejects the existence of the paranormal. So he was convinced that somebody had somehow gained access to our work and for some reason had set up a hoax, feeding our own ideas back to us to make it look convincing. And at a still further level, my colleague Chris Boyce, the author of Extraterrestrial Encounter, he became convinced that Alan and I were simply getting too close to the truth, and that somebody like the CIA had set up this whole sting with Scott and Fraser in order to make fools out of us and discredit us. And his explanation for the supposed paranormal events was that the CIA had our house bugged, and all of this stuff was going electronically to somewhere in Washington and then being fed back to us through Jim Fraser from there. So I got on to some people that I knew in the intelligence service, other than Alan, who was out of the country, and I asked them to investigate. And they were a bit ham-fisted about it, because I got a warning call from Scott and Fraser saying their phone was being tapped. And indeed it was. Wasn't being done directly at my request, but this was because I had asked for them to be checked out. And I got a report back which said, they're harmless, they're nutters, but they're harmless. And then I got another call from another of my colleagues saying, don't believe the man who just phoned you, he's not really in intelligence at all. And then I got another call saying, don't believe either of the two who've just phoned you, neither of them's in intelligence at all. And so it all was starting to get very, very intriguing.